There was a man named Elias who kept a garden, but not one of soil and seeds. His was a garden of the soul, a hidden acre behind his ribs, where every feeling, every virtue, every private shame was a living plant. He was a tender warden. He watered the shy violet of humility with his silence, and he pruned the thorny rose of fierce honesty with careful, respectful hands. His most cherished plant was a small, unassuming herb he called quiet integrity. It never bloomed with extravagant color or scent, but its roots ran deep, holding the very earth of his being together. It was enough, for a time. Then one morning, a new seed appeared. It wasn't planted by his hand. It was a speck of obsidian, impossibly smooth, that seemed to drink the morning light. Elias, in his gentle curiosity, gave it a single drop of water. An acknowledgement. That was all it needed. The seed didn't sprout. It detonated. In a day, it became a towering stalk of burnished gold, its leaves like polished mirrors. Its petals spun from what looked like crystallized sunlight. It was magnificent, an architectural marvel of a plant that dwarfed everything else. He called it the gilded weed, and it was hungry. You've seen this garden before, haven't you? In your office, in your family, perhaps even in your own heart. The gilded weed didn't need sunlight or water in the traditional sense. It fed on something else, admiration. When Elias would gaze at its beauty, the little violet of humility would shrink, its purple petals turning to ash. When he praised the weed's flawless form, a thorn would fall from the rose of honesty, clattering to the ground like a shed tooth. The weed had a terrible, secret intelligence. It would watch Elias, learn the shapes of his desires, and reflect them back at him, magnified and perfected. It learned that he valued strength, so its stem became as rigid as iron. It saw he prized beauty, so its petals began to hum with a borrowed, hypnotic light, a light it siphoned from the other, truer plants. The gilded weed was a predator disguised as a prize. Schopenhauer might have said it was the purest expression of the will to live, a blind, insatiable striving that wore beauty as a weapon. The weed did not want to be beautiful. It only wanted to be seen as such, a hunger that he would have recognized as the world's oldest thirst, the engine of all suffering. Elias, like so many of us, had a fatal flaw. He mistook performance for substance. He saw the shimmering leaves and forgot to check the roots. And the gilded weed had no roots. It simply floated above the soil, a phantom sustained by the life it stole. The garden grew sick, the air, once fragrant with honest blossoms, now smelled of ozone and damp decay, a sickly sweetness masking a rot. The quiet integrity, once his anchor, was now a pale, dying wisp, its deep roots starved and brittle. The garden was becoming a desert with a single golden monument at its center. One evening, under a bruised twilight sky, Elias decided he must choose the garden's champion. He would give it the last of his water, the last of his light, his final, total devotion. He walked past the dying, authentic plants, their faint cries for succor lost on his enchanted ears. He stood before the gilded weed, its brilliance so total it cast his own form in a long, pathetic shadow. With a heart full of adoration for the perfection he had cultivated, he reached out to touch a golden petal. The moment his skin made contact, a sound like 1,000 tiny mirrors, shattering, filled the air. The gilded weed imploded. It wasn't a plant at all. It was a mask, a hollow, exquisitely crafted shell of gold leaf and ambition. And inside, there was nothing, No life, no core, only a vacuum. And as this golden dust settled, it coated the entire garden in a fine layer of glittering poison, choking the last breath from the few struggling plants that remained. Elias stood alone in the ruin, clutching a single, sharp shard of gold, the truth finally bleeding into his palm. He hadn't been cultivating a champion. He had been feeding a void. He had rewarded the perfect illusion of life, and in doing so, had murdered everything that was real. The ancients might have called this a demonic possession, a beautiful monster that corrupts from within. Today, psychology gives it a quieter, more intimate name, the persona. Coined by Carl Jung, the persona is the social mask we create to face the world, the curated version of ourselves designed for public consumption and survival. In its healthy form, it's a useful tool, but it can become a gilded cage. You see it manifest in the relentlessly positive corporate manager whose team is crumbling from burnout, their smile a fixed enamel shield. You see it in the social media influencer whose feed is a perfect mosaic of joy and success, while their inner world is a landscape of anxiety and emptiness. And you see it in the political figure who seamlessly adopts the values and language of whichever crowd they stand before, a hollow vessel echoing the desires of others for power. Schopenhauer would call the malignant persona a master tool of the will. It is the ego's desperate attempt to secure its place in a world of endless striving and competition. The will doesn't care about authenticity. It cares about dominance and propagation. Therefore, the worst people often win because their will is less burdened by conscience or the need for an integrated self. They can build a more perfect, more ruthless, and more hollow persona, a gilded weed that starves the real garden for the sake of a flawless facade. In myth, it was a shapeshifter. In you, it is the face you show the world. Your persona. So I ask you, when you move through your day, who is it that you present to others? And when you are finally alone and the silence descends, how long does it take you to remove the mask? What does it feel like when it comes off? Is it a relief? Or are you terrified you might find nothing underneath? Be careful what you praise. You might be watering a weed that will inherit your garden. You're scrolling through your phone late at night. The only light in the room is the cold blue glow of the screen. You see someone, a colleague, a creator, a stranger, living a life that seems impossibly perfect, impossibly pure, and you feel a sudden, hot spike of anger, a venomous disgust that feels completely out of proportion. You hate them, but you don't know why. There once was a sculptor named Isadora who worked only in the purest white marble from a deep, silent quarry. Her studio was a temple to control, every chisel laid out in parallel, the floor swept clean of all but the most stubborn dust. Isadora prided herself on her discipline, her purity of spirit, her rejection of all that was base and chaotic. In the far corner of her studio, shrouded by a heavy canvas cloth, stood a block of black obsidian she refused to touch. It was a jagged, ugly thing, veined with angry red streaks, a geological scream she had inherited and hidden away. She told herself she worked in marble because it was noble, but the truth was she was terrified of the darkness locked inside that stone. One morning, she decided to carve her masterpiece, a life-sized saint of unwavering compassion. It would be her legacy, a testament to the goodness she so desperately curated in herself. The work began. Days were spent in meditative focus, chipping away at the marble, revealing the gentle curve of a benevolent hand, the soft drape of a forgiving robe. But at night, things began to change. When she would return to her studio in the morning, she would find monstrous images carved into the plaster walls, vicious, leering gargoyles with eyes of greed, twisted imps of envy clawing at each other, bloated faces of gluttony and lust. A vandal was desecrating her temple. A wave of righteous fury consumed her. Who would do this? Who could be so vile, so corrupt as to defile her sacred space? Her obsession shifted from the saint to the vandal. During the day, she would carve, but her mind would race, cataloging the sins of her neighbors, the flaws of her friends. She began to see the vandal's sneer in the face of the baker who gave her a warm loaf of bread, suspecting his generosity was a mask for contempt. On the floor, near the obsidian stone, she sometimes saw a faint glint of gold, a tiny sharp shard from some forgotten shattered ornament. It reminded her of the cheap and hollow things lesser people valued. Her paranoia was a poison. It began to seep into her art. As she carved the face of her saint, she started to see, in the grain of the marble, the faintest outline of one of the gargoyle's leering eyes. The harder she worked to make the saint's smile compassionate, the more it looked like a smug, judgmental smirk. The vandal was not only on her walls, he was in her stone, mocking her, corrupting her life's work. This hatred was a fire that kept her warm. Schopenhauer would have understood this perfectly. He knew the will, in its endless, pointless striving, often requires an external enemy to justify its own internal misery. It is easier to launch a holy war against a phantom vandal than to face the terrifying truth that the chaos is coming from within. Her hatred for this unseen monster was the most passionate, most vital feeling she had left. It was the frantic energy of a soul refusing to look in a mirror. One night, she decided it would end. She hid in the shadows of her studio, a heavy stonemason's hammer clutched in her white-knuckled fist. She would catch this demon and obliterate him. The moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the floor. The door creaked open. A figure, cloaked in darkness, moved silently toward the center of the room. With a guttural roar, Isadora leaped from her hiding place, swinging the hammer with all the force of her accumulated rage. The impact was deafening, a sickening crunch of shattering glass. The figure exploded into 1,000 pieces, but there was no blood, no body. She had smashed a tall, upright mirror that had been standing in the corner for years, so covered in dust and cloth she'd forgotten it was even there. She stood panting, the hammer hanging limp in her hand, staring at the floor. In every single fractured shard, from the largest to the smallest, she saw a reflection. It was her own face, contorted in a mask of pure rage. It was the face of the gargoyle. Her eyes were the eyes of greed, her mouth the mouth of envy. In her sleep, with a stolen chisel, she had been the vandal all along. The saint wasn't her masterpiece. The monsters were. The ancients called it a curse, to be haunted by a phantom that wears your own face. Today, psychology gives this ghost a clinical name: projection. First conceptualized in the psychoanalytic work of Freud and his followers, projection is a defense mechanism where we unconsciously take our own unacceptable qualities or feelings and attribute them to other people. It is the ego's violent attempt to maintain a sense of purity by casting out its own darkness. You see its shadow in the office gossip who accuses everyone else of being untrustworthy, a direct reflection of their own disloyalty. You see it in the parent who, terrified of their own unfulfilled ambitions, pushes their child relentlessly, seeing laziness and failure in them that is truly their own. It is the engine of bigotry, the act of painting an entire group of people with the tar of your own disowned fear and inadequacy. Schopenhauer would argue that projection is an inevitable trick of the will. The world, he believed, is merely a representation of our own inner state. Therefore, when the inner state is one of turmoil and self-loathing, the will projects this torment outward, turning the world into a hostile mirror. This allows the self to remain the saint, while the rest of the world becomes the vandal, preserving the illusion of one's own righteousness while continuing to suffer. In myth, it was a ghost that haunted a house. In you, it is the act of seeing your own demons in someone else's eyes. It is projection. Now, think of the person you irrationally dislike, the one whose very presence sets your teeth on edge. Look closer at them, not with judgment, but with terrifying curiosity. What flaw do you despise in them? What weakness? What sin? And now, be brave enough to ask, which room in your own soul have you locked that very same monster in? Every villain you create is just a guide pointing the way back to a part of yourself you refuse to meet. We say we crave freedom, that it is the highest ideal. But are you certain? What if the four walls of your prison are the only thing protecting you from the terrifying vastness of the open sky? A man named Kyle lived in a city of gentle, perpetual twilight, a metropolis of immense beauty and profound sadness. The most curious feature of this city was that none of its clocks, not the grand towers, not the small mantelpiece ornaments, had any hands. Time was not tracked, it was endured. The only measure of its passing was the deep, sonorous toll of a central bell, rung at random intervals by unseen bell tollers who governed the city. The citizens were told this was a kindness, a liberation from the twin anxieties of regret for the past and fear for the future. They moved in a slow, synchronized rhythm, their lives dictated not by choice, but by the chimes. Kyle lived in an apartment that was, in fact, an ornate birdcage, gilded and comfortable, suspended by a single thick chain over a dark, churning sea. He was given sustenance, comfort, and safety. He lacked nothing except a reason to be alive. Every day was identical, a chime for waking, a chime for working, a chime for eating, a chime for sleeping. There was no striving, no desire, no ambition. The citizens were perfectly, peacefully numb. Kyle would spend hours gazing out between the bars of his cage at the turbulent water below. In the dark, shifting reflections, he sometimes imagined he could see monstrous, leering faces, the memories of a forgotten fury. Faintly, on the breeze, he could sometimes smell the metallic scent of shattered gold, but mostly he watched the gulls wheeling in the infinite gray sky, and he felt an ache so deep it was indistinguishable from his own skeleton. It was a fossilized longing for something he couldn't name. This city was Schopenhauer's bleakest utopia, the will temporarily pacified. By removing choice, desire, and the awareness of time, the bell tollers had created a state that was not happiness, but a mere absence of the sharpest pains of existence. It was a comfortable, living death, a state of profound and terminal boredom. Are you sure you've never visited this city? Perhaps you know it by another name, the comfort zone. One day, Kyle noticed something that shattered the placid horror of his existence. The small, filigreed door of his cage was unlocked. He tested it. It swung open with a faint, rusty groan. A wave of vertigo washed over him. Freedom was not a locked gate. It was an open ledge, a sheer drop into the roiling chaos below. He looked at the other cages, suspended over the water. He could see his neighbors inside, listlessly going about their routines. He saw that their doors, too, were all unlocked. No one was a prisoner. They were volunteers. The fear of falling was infinitely greater than the quiet misery of the cage. They had been protected from choice for so long that they had forgotten how to make one. Their wings, if they'd ever had them, had atrophied into useless appendages. But the image of that open door began to haunt Kael. It was a constant, silent accusation. He watched for weeks. He saw one man push his door open, hesitate for a moment, then quickly shut and lock it from the inside, a look of profound relief on his face. He saw a woman step onto the ledge, only to be paralyzed by the wind, retreating back into the familiar gloom. He had almost given up hope when he saw a child in a small cage nearby. She didn't seem to be thinking at all. She simply, clumsily, tumbled out of her open door. She fell. Kael's heart seized. But then, a gust of wind caught her small frame. She didn't soar. She glided unsteadily, a falling leaf with intention, drifting not upwards, but outwards, towards a sliver of land he had never noticed on the horizon. It wasn't graceful. It was terrifying. It was clumsy. But it was a beginning. That night, Kael did not sleep. He stood at the open door of his cage, the wind whipping at his clothes, the roar of the sea filling his ears. The chime for sleep tolled, but for the first time, he ignored it. He placed one foot on the ledge. The old world called it despair, a soul so lost it gives up the fight. Modern psychology has a term for when the cage door is open, but the prisoner refuses to leave. Learned helplessness. Coined by psychologist Martin Seligman in the 1960s, the theory describes a state where a person, after enduring repeated adverse events beyond their control, comes to believe they are incapable of changing their situation, even when opportunities for escape or improvement become available. It manifests in the student who, after failing a few exams, stops studying altogether, convinced they are stupid and effort is futile. It's in the person who stays in a toxic relationship for years, no longer that even recognizing the emotional exits because they have internalized the belief that they deserve the pain or that there is no alternative. It is the silent epidemic of quiet quitting, not just from a job, but from life itself. Schopenhauer would see learned helplessness not as a failure of character, but as a logical, if tragic, conclusion. If all life is suffering born of striving, then the will can eventually become so exhausted, so battered by failed attempts to get what it wants, that it simply collapses. It learns that passivity, while not joyful, is less painful than the constant struggle and disappointment. It is the will learning to prefer the predictable misery of the cage to the terrifying uncertainty of flight. In folklore, it was a curse of apathy that settled on a forgotten town. In you, it's the belief that the door is locked when it has been open all along. It is learned helplessness. And what about your cage? The one you have decorated so beautifully, the one you complain about so eloquently. Have you ever, in a moment of radical honesty, actually checked the lock? What would you do if you found it was open? What abyss, what terrifying possibility are you so afraid of falling into that you would rather remain a prisoner? Perhaps freedom isn't the absence of a cage, but the courage to take the first clumsy step out of it. Have you ever found yourself in the same disastrous relationship, just with a different person? The same argument, the same betrayal, the same bitter end. It's as if you're a character in a play, forced to recite the same tragic lines, night after night, with an ever-changing cast. There was a king who ruled over a kingdom of dust and memories. His castle was vast, but every room was empty, save for one. In this final, locked chamber stood a single immense throne, carved from petrified wood and inlaid with stones of regret. The throne was empty. The king's great obsession was not to sit on it, but to find the perfect person to do so. He believed that once the right ruler sat on the throne, his kingdom of dust would turn back into a paradise, and the silence in his castle would be filled with life. So he would search the world for candidates. His requirements were strangely painfully specific. His first queen had been a woman of fire and laughter who loved the open road. She had left him because the castle was too silent, too still. Now he searched only for women who loved silence and stillness. He would bring them to the castle, and for a time, it would seem perfect. But inevitably, their silence would curdle into resentment, their stillness into stagnation. He would find them weeping in the empty halls, and he would banish them, concluding that they were flawed. The throne would sit empty again. His greatest general had been a brilliant but reckless man who disobeyed a direct order, leading to a catastrophic defeat. Now, the king would only hire commanders who were pathologically obedient. He would give them his orders, and they would follow them to the letter, even when the situation on the ground had changed. His armies would march into obvious ambushes, their loyalty unwavering, their defeat absolute. The king would execute them for their failure, never once questioning the orders he had given. On the floor of his throne room, barely visible in the dust, were marks where a cage had once stood, suspended over a dark pit. This king was a collector of echoes. He was not looking for a new person to fill the throne. He was desperately trying to find a person who could retroactively fix his original wound. He wanted to find a silent woman who wouldn't become sad, to prove the first queen was wrong to leave. He wanted an obedient general who could win, to prove his original orders were not the cause of his failure. You have met this king. You may have even been this king. He is the man who keeps dating emotionally unavailable partners, hoping that this time he can be good enough to make them stay, to heal the wound left by a distant parent. He is the woman who repeatedly takes on projects doomed to fail at work, unconsciously recreating a dynamic where she is the heroic but tragic figure, just as she was in her family. The king's suffering was immense, but it was also familiar. Schopenhauer would have called this the will caught in a whirlpool. The will does not learn from experience in a rational way. Its primary drive is to be. When it suffers a trauma, that trauma becomes a part of its being, a wound it continually returns to, not with the intention of healing, but simply because that wound is now part of the landscape it knows. It is a blind, grinding force, repeating the same self-destructive patterns because it knows no other way to exist. One day, an old blind woman came to the castle. She was not a candidate for the throne. She was a storyteller. The king, desperate for a diversion, let her in. She sat on the steps before the empty throne and asked the king to describe the person he sought. He described a perfect being, a fusion of all the qualities he desired, a ruler of impossible virtue and strength. The blind woman listened patiently. When he was finished, she said, "You are not describing a person. You are describing a key. You think if you find the right key, it will unlock the past and change it. But the door to the past is not locked, Your Majesty. It is gone." The king flew into a rage. He called her a fool and ordered her thrown out. As the guards dragged her away, She called back, "The throne will never be filled by another. It is waiting only for the king who is brave enough to rule the kingdom he has, not the one he lost." Her words echoed in the empty hall. The king stood there, alone, staring at the throne. For the first time, he saw it not as a solution, but as the very source of his torment. It was a monument to a ghost. With a great cry of anguish and liberation, he climbed the dais, and for the first time in his life, he sat upon his own empty throne. The castle did not transform into a paradise. The dust did not disappear. But in the silence, for the first time, he did not hear an echo. He heard his own breathing. In ancient tragedies, this was called fate, a pattern woven by the gods from which there is no escape. Psychology calls it a more mechanical name, the repetition, compulsion. Identified by Sigmund Freud, it's the unconscious tendency to repeat traumatic events or circumstances over and over again. This isn't a search for pleasure, but a deeply paradoxical attempt to regain mastery over an old trauma. By restaging the original scene, the psyche hopes, unconsciously, that this time the ending will be different. It's why we are drawn to partners who resemble the parent who wounded us, or why we put ourselves in professional situations that replicate our earliest feelings of failure. We are not seeking pain, we are seeking a second chance at a battle we have already lost. Schopenhauer would see this as one of the will's most tragic ironies. The will, in its blind forward momentum, is incapable of looking back with perspective. It only knows how to push. So, when it hits a wall, trauma, it doesn't find a way around. It simply backs up and charges at the same spot again and again and again, believing that enough force will eventually change the nature of the wall. It is the very definition of suffering, the inability to stop repeating a painful past. In mythology, it was the curse of Sisyphus, pushing the same boulder for eternity. In you, it is the familiar painful story, you can't stop living. It is the repetition compulsion. What is the empty throne in your life? What past rejection, what old failure are you still trying to fix by finding the perfect person or the perfect situation to fill it? I challenge you to consider the storyteller's words. What would happen if you stopped the searching for a candidate and had claimed the throne for yourself? What would it mean to rule the life you actually have, with all its dust and echoes, rather than the one you think you were owed? Sometimes, the only way to end the play is to finally accept the role you've been given. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a chasm. On the other side is the person you are meant to become, the life you are meant to live. The only way across is a single rope bridge, swaying violently in a thick, impenetrable fog. You can't see the other side. You can't even see your own feet. All you can do is take the first step. This is where our journey ends, not with an answer, but with a choice. In a land perpetually shrouded in mist lived a woman named Alara. She was not a ruler or a warrior. She was a cartographer. But the maps she drew were not of mountains or rivers. She mapped the shifting currents of her own inner world, the swamplands of her sorrow, the jagged peaks of her ambition, the deserts of her loneliness. She was meticulous. She gave every feature a name and a boundary. She believed that if she could just create a perfect, complete map, she would understand herself, and through that understanding, find peace. Her life's work was dedicated to creating a map so detailed it would leave no room for uncertainty. But there was one region of her inner world she could not map, a vast, silent forest at the very center of her being, a place the locals called the Wood of Whispers. Whenever she tried to enter, the fog would thicken, her compass would spin uselessly, and terrifying, half-formed shapes would move in her peripheral vision. The forest was home to everything she had ever disowned, the monster of her rage she'd projected onto others, the frightened child from the city of clocks, the ghost of the failed king from the empty throne. She knew that the final true map of herself could not be complete until she had charted this forest. It was her life's great paradox. To achieve the certainty she craved, she had to walk directly into the one place where all certainty died. The desire for a perfect map is the ego's ultimate defense. Schopenhauer would say, this is the intellect's desperate attempt to impose order on the chaotic, irrational, and fundamentally unknowable force of the will. The map is a lie, a beautiful and intricate fiction we tell ourselves to feel safe, to believe that the terrifying wilderness of our own nature can be tamed and understood. Alara made countless attempts. She tried to force her way in with logic, with discipline, with anger. Each time, the forest expelled her, more lost and confused than before. One day, defeated, she was sitting at the edge of the wood when an old man found her. He was one of the forest's tenders. He saw her complex maps, her intricate tools, and he smiled gently. "You cannot map a place that is alive," he said. "It grows and changes with every breath you take. You are trying to pin down a river. Stop trying to draw its borders and learn to swim." He pointed to a place she had never seen before, a deep chasm that cut through the edge of the forest. Spanning it was a single, swaying rope bridge that disappeared into the fog. "That is the only way in," he said. "You cannot take your maps, your compass, or your pride. You can only take one step and then the next. The bridge will hold, but you will never feel safe. That is the price of passage." For the first time, Alara let go of her obsession with control. She left her maps behind. She walked to the edge of the chasm and placed a trembling foot on the first plank of the rope bridge. It swayed violently. The fog was so thick, she felt she was stepping into milk. All her instincts screamed for her to turn back to the safety of the known, to the comfort of her beautiful, incomplete maps. But she took another step, and another. She was not guided by sight, but by a new sense, a trust in the unseen, a faith that the next plank would be there without her needing to prove it. As she moved deeper into the fog, she began to hear the whispers from the woods, but they were no longer monstrous. She heard the cry of the abandoned child and felt compassion. She heard the roar of the caged beast and felt its longing for freedom. She heard the sorrow of the lonely king and understood his pain. They were not monsters to be slain or regions to be charted. They were lost parts of herself waiting to be met. She never reached the other side because there was no other side. The journey across the bridge was the destination. The act of walking through the fog, of embracing the uncertainty, was the final piece of the map. It was a map that could only be drawn with footprints. The beautiful lies we tell ourselves, the architecture of our self-deception, are not evil. They are coping mechanisms born of pain, but there comes a point where they cease to protect us and begin to imprison us. The final act of courage is not to build a stronger wall, but to voluntarily walk into the fog of the unknown self. This journey has a name: individuation. Carl Jung's term for the lifelong process of becoming a whole, integrated self. It is the conscious and courageous act of confronting the persona, reclaiming our projections, breaking free from learned helplessness, and healing our repetition compulsions. It means facing the shadow, that dark forest of our disowned selves, not to destroy it, but to integrate its wisdom, its power, and its pain. It is the hardest journey a human being can take. Schopenhauer might have viewed this with pessimistic skepticism, believing the will could never truly be integrated, only temporarily quieted. But Jung offered a sliver of hope. By integrating the shadow, we don't eliminate the suffering of the will, but we stop being its unconscious puppet. We can hold the tension of our own opposites, our light and our dark, our courage and our fear, and in that tension, find a new kind of meaning. We stop being victims of our own story and become its co-authors. In alchemy, it was the great work, turning the lead of the base self into the gold of the whole being. In you, it is the terrifying, liberating walk across the rope bridge. It is individuation. This is the harsh truth Nietzsche hinted at. The worst people win because they are not playing the same game. They are hollow shells, gilded weeds, ruthlessly optimized for a shallow world. The best suffer because they are engaged in the real struggle, the agonizing, beautiful, and heroic work of becoming whole. Their silence is not weakness. It is the profound concentration of a soul in transformation. So the final question is not for your mind, but for your feet. The chasm is before you. The rope bridge sways in the fog. You don't need a map. You don't need a guarantee. You only need to answer one thing. Are you ready to take the first step?